Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States, an ongoing inquiry into the origins of the United States. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He is also your host for this conversation. And now here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome everyone to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. I am Bill O'Brien, and once again, let me say first that I am very, very happy, very proud. I'm honored to be here, and I am really, really moved by the fact that you are here, and I appreciate that so very much. We're beginning an hour early today, and I neglected to announce it yesterday, but I know that Bob did last evening on his program. I got so into Roosevelt's new nationalism speech yesterday that I neglected to mention that we would be beginning an hour earlier today. I have a board meeting to chair. I am the I've mentioned before that I'm president of the local Beckley Rotary Club this year, and we're having our first board meeting this evening, and it begins at 5:30 this evening. So I've got to basically be off the air at 5 rather than 6 Eastern Time. And that'll give me a half an hour to get myself together and go and chair that meeting this evening. So I apologize for not mentioning this yesterday. Let me also say, while I'm on that subject, that the Virtual Center next week, on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, will be a repeat of previous programs that we've had. I'll be on the road. I'm traveling to New England, and I won't be back until Wednesday evening, which is the evening of our third program of the week. So effectively, there'll be no new programming next week, or no opportunity for you to call directly into the program next week. Bob's going to be selecting key programs, not just recent ones I don't expect, but perhaps programs from the past. Some of them obviously have been, have touched a nerve a little bit more than others. And so there were some programs that even I at the end of them had a feeling that they were okay, but there was nothing earth-shattering in them. And then there were some that even I've gotten so worked up I was kind of wishing we could just go on a particular day, because it seemed like we were running out of time. And I don't quite know what that is. I felt like yesterday was one of those programs as we got into Roosevelt, because I really believe that this issue is so significant, and I want to pick up on that today. But more than anything else, I'd like to hear from you, your reactions to some of these issues, because I think that they are incredibly important issues. And I hope that I've been able to present the material in such a way that it has been informative for you, if not enlightening, at least informative. Because I think that there's some new information here. I know we spent a little bit of time talking about Gabriel Coco's research and his publication of his Triumph of Conservatism book about progressivism and his whole basic thesis. I mean, I remember when I first encountered that book and that thesis, I was absolutely stunned. I couldn't believe it. I had never really thought about that whole perspective, that in reality progressivism was a corporate response to something which for them might prove much more dire if they didn't make some sort of an effort. And so in a sense, that whole interpretation, once I encountered it and spent some time reflecting on it and began to look at, for myself as to how comfortable I was with it, whether it in fact seemed to answer my questions, what I began to find very honestly is that more often than not, it did answer my questions. It made a lot of sense to me. It answered a lot of questions. Because I can remember focusing an awful lot of attention in years that I was a student, as well as years that I was actually teaching American history. I can remember focusing on the theme, on the issue of who were the progressives. What were they after? What were their priorities? And as you look at the research, and some of it it's incredibly, the research that's been done in this period is, right at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, is voluminous. And some of the studies that have come out have been very, very, very insightful, very challenging, etc. And I'd looked at them as well. And I began to find that a lot of my questions about, who were the progressives, what kinds of things did they want, but more important, what kinds of things did they not want? What were they most afraid of? Why were they so concerned about things like labor unions and the success of labor organization and the potential that seemed to exist for agriculture and urban labor to get together, to unite? And the Knights were after it, and then the populace went after it, as reflected in their party platform in 1892. And I began to think about that from the perspective of the progressives. And there are a couple of things about progressivism that I thought I would maybe throw into the pot today before we leave it. I'd like to get back and just look at a couple of additional issues that Theodore Roosevelt in his New Nationalism speech touched on. Then what I'd like to do is go into the Supreme Court. There's no question that the focal decision on the whole issue of progressivism seems, not only to me but to most scholars of this period, the 1905 decision of the Supreme Court in Lochner versus New York. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on that decision and the rationale for it. And also I want to look at a couple of the dissents against that decision, because I think if you look at the rationale for the decision by the majority, it was a 5-4 decision by the court. And if you look at the rationale for the decision by the majority, and then you look at two of the major dissents, one of them by Oliver Wendell Holmes, the other one by Justice Harlan, you begin to get a sense of the issues. You can pretty well begin to frame progressivism as well as the opposition to it right around that particular case. So I think that case becomes very, very telling about this whole issue. And very honestly, I believe that by the time we finish our program today, we probably will have a pretty good idea going into the 20th century and going into the origins of the Depression and FDR's so-called New Deal. I say so-called New Deal because when you say New Deal, there is an implication there that there was a plan. And one of the things you find out from Roosevelt is that there really wasn't a plan, that this was kind of a work in progress from Roosevelt's perspective. But then what you got to look at is who was Roosevelt and what would a work in progress orchestrated by him really involve. And I think you get a pretty good insight into the 1930s and the role of Congress in the 1930s in the so-called New Deal very well. But before we do that, let me again repeat that we are an hour earlier today. We will end our 2 hours at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And next week we will have repeat programs on the Virtual Center. There will not be the opportunity to call in and respond in time, next week. I will be back the following Monday, and we'll kind of pick up at the Virtual Center. And what I'm encouraging you to do is if you have reactions to any of the programming next week, by all means hold them, and let's address them when we get back live the week after next. The phone number, and I'd love to hear from you today. The phone number, area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to share your thinking, your ideas, and concerns with me personally, and I commit that I will respond to you. My email address is waobrien906. That's IEN O'Brien 906, all one word, @gmail.com. waobrien906 @gmail.com. theodorerooseveltspeech.com. To just go back and pick up where we were yesterday, I was going to say we were in the middle of. We're actually beyond the middle of. We're moving towards the final third of Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism speech. But one of the issues I wanted to reemphasize from yesterday, which I think is particularly significant, is that in this speech, Roosevelt makes it very clear that his proposal, what he calls the new nationalism, what he referred to early in the speech as the square deal, is not radicalism. There's absolutely no question by the specific references he makes to mob violence and to the sanctity of private property and his willingness to support it, even though he believes that the circumstances which produced the need for progressivism were created by corporate America, by large organizations which were destroying the values and the opportunity that was essential, that remains essential to the functioning of the American Republic. His basic thesis was that the acquisition and control of insatiable amounts of property by certain interests is reflecting negatively on the opportunities available to everybody else and the abilities of the American dream to even remain functional. And his whole perspective is, if we don't come in and make a change and do something, we're going to lose it all. And he makes specific references to the threat of mob violence. And what he is basically saying is, what I am proposing is an alternative to mob violence. That's the radicalism. That's not where we are. And then, if you remember, he had a specific statement about the fact that he was a conservative and that this was what he called a particular kind of conservatism. And he rejects the radicalism and the mob violence that is happening both in urban labor and in agriculture during this period. And he's basically proposing an alternative, a middle road. And what he's suggesting is, if we don't do this, then we're going to be in serious trouble because this nation is going to implode. And part of the reason is because the entire middle-class value system that makes this system what it is, the idea of equality, the pursuit of equality, the idea that everybody is entitled to an equal chance, the idea that the system is designed to support and reward those who are willing to do for themselves. The system must move in and support those who are temporarily out of commission so that they can get back on their feet and get back into the competition. But the reality is, by the time he's speaking in this speech in the early 20th century, there has been so much destruction of the idea of equality of opportunity. There is so little opportunity left that those who feel totally shut out of the system are taking the law or taking matters into their own hands and proposing alternatives which, from a middle-class point of view, are radical because they literally threaten the sanctity of private property. This is the worst extreme of the majority faction that James Madison warned about, both in Federalist Number 10 and Federalist 51. And the reality is that for Madison, the security and stability of society was based on there being so many competing interests and factions that no one could unite and create the majority, which, if it indeed was allowed to organize and become functional, would, under the rules of our democratic system, under the idea of majority vote, the majority faction would literally take control of the reins of power. And to Madison, that was the biggest threat that he saw to the constitutional system that he and the others created at Philadelphia. That's why the Knights of Labor appeal to all those who work. The populist appeal, direct appeal to try to enlist the support and the membership of urban labor, of unions, into the populist movement. The reality is, if that movement is successful, then you do have an organized, active majority faction with a goal, which is, through the ballot box, to literally take control of this country. And it is to that threat, I believe, Theodore Roosevelt is responding. And I would suggest to you, it is to that threat that progressivism itself is the response. So if you do look at the research as to who the progressives were on the city level, at the state level, or whatever, you begin to realize, and of course there are exceptions to this. These are general statements. They tend to be middle-class movements. They tend to be movements by people whose objective is to preserve the system from those who would destroy it. These are people who are committed to the system. They are people who realize that the system is not working the way it's supposed to, the way, in the abstract, in the ideal, it's supposed to work. They appreciate the fact that there's too much violence, there's too much crime, there's too much poverty, there's too much abuse of one group by another. They realize that the American dream as we know it is going down the tube, so to speak. So what progressivism is an effort to use government to take back control and to institute the kind of reforms which will reinvigorate the system of free enterprise and the idea of the public, which puts a value on individual freedom and access to equality of opportunity, or something that remotely is approaching it. And a point that I would make, this is kind of an aside, but I think it's an important one. A lot of this is psychological. And when you look at the idea, this concept of equality of opportunity, it's important to recognize that we're not necessarily talking about real equality of opportunity. That's an objective. That's something that we seem to be working toward. But I don't think anybody ever really expects to get there. We're not going to get to a point where everybody really has, in hard, fast, objective terms, an opportunity equal to what everybody else has. That's an ideal. But the key is people have to believe that the ideal is attainable. People have to believe that they have a chance. Because if they believe that they don't, then they cease to participate in the program. And if too many people drop out of the game, so to speak, the game can't work. The reason I'm putting so much time in this, because I think much of this speaks to what we're involved in today, with the tremendous threat of inequality in our society. President Obama, for example, makes the point that while the recession, we have turned the corner on the recession and recovery is happening, it's happening too slowly. It's not happening fast enough. Jobs are not returning the way they should. the opportunities for the vast majority of the American people, we don't see them. We don't see them coming back. We don't see the real kind of recovery that we would hope for in a real recovery from the recession. And what the president is the first to say is that while there are good signs about what's happening in the economy and the fact that we are rebounding from the recession, most of the positives that are coming from the rebound are going to the 1%. A few people are doing very well in American society, but too many people are not. The middle class, you hear over and over again, is being hammered. There are too many people, if you look at state after state, in terms of the number of youngsters in school who fall into the categories that entitle them to free breakfasts and free lunches. You begin to realize that there are too many people in this country that are literally dependent on the dole. And if the jobs aren't there, if the opportunities are not there, then where does the incentive come to pursue education, to pursue training, job training, and all the rest of it? The whole thing reverberates, from down the ladder, so to speak. And so ultimately, the whole system needs to be reinvigorated. We're really looking for something resembling a rebirth of something we call progressivism. Because the fact of the matter is, if we keep going in the direction we're going in, we're going to have to deal with the same kinds of outcomes and realities that Roosevelt was trying to avoid in the early 20th century, that progressivism was designed to short circuit and make unnecessary. And so the fact of the matter is, these people, Roosevelt and the other progressives, believed that you had to basically resume or reinstitute or reinsert government back into this equation as a major factor. And Wilson made the point about paternalism and talked about the philosophical idea of big government in the face of big corporations, in the face of big industry. Then ultimately we need to combat bigness with bigness. And if you get bigness in labor unions with bigness in management, you don't have the answer. You have the makings of World War III domestically. So ultimately, the bigness that we need to deal with, we need to deal with from an equal perspective, and it needs to be government that does it. And so what's emerging here is a redefinition, if you will, of government's role and of what government's role really is. And so in Roosevelt, what you begin to see is that the position he takes about mob violence, the position he takes about the threats to property. I think the most telling thing here is in one paragraph, he talks about the threat to mob violence, and we will not put up with it, even though we can understand the circumstances which are giving rise to it. Then, not too much later in the speech, he talks about the threats to private property, and he acknowledges that the circumstances which produced the need for progressivism in the first place are caused by the acquisition of huge and unconscionable amounts of property by a few large, powerful organizations. The ability of special interests to influence government at all levels. And we have got to take these special interests out of the equation. And what that means is we have got to get both sides looking to government as the honest broker. People need to trust government enough that they don't feel it's necessary to take matters into their own hands. And if we can do that, then government managed by the right people with the right objectives and the right incentives will be able to make the kinds of reforms and adjustments that are necessary to reinvigorate the middle-class value system that really is the essence of what American society and free enterprise needs to be all about. And Roosevelt emphasizes the fact that government's responsibility is not to represent special interests. Government's responsibility is to represent the public interest, to represent the interests of everybody. That means government must have the power to make the decisions about what is the best particular solution to a particular problem. And those people who are most directly involved in that problem must be willing to accept the fact that government's decision not only is final, but it is fair and just, and that it was made with due consideration to the interests of all those directly involved. And progressives believe that if we can reinstitute that kind of faith in the system, then we can move into the next phase, which is the 20th century. That's the only way we can manage the Industrial Revolution and begin to address some of the problems that have come from it. The problems of crime, the problems of disease, the problems of health, the problems of unfair labor practices, unsafe labor practices, deaths in the mine, deaths in the factory, the use of child labor, the breakdown of the family because women are being forced to leave the home and work in factories, what impact that's having on the young people, the influx of immigrants coming into the country because corporate America is insatiable in its demand for cheap labor. So the country literally is becoming overwhelmed with immigrants from all over Europe, many of them speaking different languages, many of them coming here with a variety of different religions. And what we end up with in our cities are organized, are nationally organized neighborhoods, little Italys and little Hungaries and little Czechoslovakias and little Russias and those kinds of things. And many of them begin to produce their own newspapers in their own language. And the question is, we've got to find a way to turn this into what many of the progressive, and this is progressive, the idea of the melting pot, the idea that America must be something that can take this diversity and mix it all up and produce one common new thing that everybody has in common, which is called the American. And that's really, this is the solution. One of the things that's happening, and these are some of the insights about progressivism that I think help us to understand this. One of the things that happened during this period is the major research in the area called the social sciences that are coming out of our colleges and universities at that time. And I don't necessarily want to go into this, but I think having spent so many years in higher education, I think students tend to find this rather interesting and fascinating because they had no idea, where any of this came from. But when I mention to students, for example, when I talk about this entity we call the social sciences, and from their perspective, the only thing they know about the social sciences is the category of courses that they have to pick curriculum from when they are planning their college schedules, their class schedules. And they know, for example, and I'm speaking from very specific terms, but for example, in the General Studies program at Concord University, which is where I spent the last 22 years, in the General Studies program, students were required as part of their curriculum to take at least 4 social science classes. But that requirement went even further than that. Those 4 classes had to be in at least 3 different disciplines, 3 different content areas. So then you look at the list of classes that are considered to be in the social sciences: psychology, sociology, political science, history, government, economics, geography. And so what happens is that in every one of those different disciplines, in geography, in sociology, in psychology, in history, in government, in all of them, economics, there is one or more courses that are targeted, that are identified as general studies courses. And students must, no matter what their major is, students must take at least 4 social science classes in at least 3 of those disciplines. And the rationale for that is that in a liberal arts institution, as part of a liberal education, it is important that students have a broad education in a number of different content areas. We want students to understand what psychology is about. We want students to understand what questions psychologists bring to the table. We want students to know about sociology. What is it that sociologists do? What contribution to American society do we look for from sociologists? What is the value of requiring a course in American government, in political science? What is the course of what is the benefit of requiring a course in history, or 2-semester American history course, or a world history course, or whatever? What is the value of requiring students to take a course in world geography? Or, and this happens to be true, they could either take world geography or they could take cultural geography. Or they could take both. But they couldn't take more than 2 because they had to complete 4. So what students ended up with oftentimes was 5 and 6 courses in the social science area, especially if they happened to change their majors. For example, if they were business majors, one of the social science options had to be economics. And those are the kinds of things that faculty members, that's what faculty advising is all about, is making students aware of what those options and what those requirements are. Because at the end of the day, when they're ready to graduate, they come with a whole list of classes that they've completed. They come to their advisor, and their advisor has to check off and make sure that they've met all the particular requirements for the degree that they seek. And when they don't, it produces a very bad situation, because oftentimes students have to end up going an extra semester in order to make up classes that they didn't take coming through the first time. But the point I'm trying to make about the progressive period is the progressive period is when something we call the social sciences comes into being. Have you ever thought about the term social sciences? What does that mean? The idea that there are certain areas of study where you can study individual behavior, psychology, and based on your study and on the research of clinical psychologists and research psychologists, we can actually begin to understand how the brain works and how people make decisions and how people basically behave. We can understand human behavior by concentrating in the area of psychology. So what students do in the Intro to Psychology class is they look at various psychologists and various schools of psychology, and they look at the kinds of questions that those researchers brought to the table, so to speak, and look through the years as to how psychology contributes to one's overall understanding of the society as a whole. Sociologists study their research emphasis is on the behavior of individuals within a social setting. How much of the individual's behavior is determined by family? How much of education is determined by religion, by the particular church you go to? How much of individual behavior is determined by the people you play with, or the people you work with, or the people you go to college with? Remember Benjamin Rush in 1786 in his Mode of Education, Proper in a Republic, talks about the importance of education, and he makes the point that people who study together and skate together and engage in sports and athletic activities together are able to understand and get along. In other words, the challenges of diversity are resolved when you bring these different groups together and expose one group to another. This is the rationale for what we call in our society integration. The whole idea of integration in civil rights is based on the idea that you can't allow these separate groups to exist independent of the society as a whole. You've got to force these individuals into the group, even if you have to put kids on buses and bus them around all over different cities and everything. You've got to put minority students into classrooms with members of the majority so that the values of the majority of the middle class rub off on them. It's a process. It's laid out by Benjamin Rush in 1786, and it's still practiced. But the whole idea of, again, of psychology and sociology, the idea of history, what did this republic, how did this republic begin? What were its objectives? What were the founders after? What did they want to do? What were some of the issues involved in the evolution of this republic as we move through the years, which is really what American history is about? Political science, government. Can you imagine? Think about the term political science. It's based on the assumption that certain political structures produce certain individual citizen behaviors and attitudes. That if students, youngsters, grow up in a particular political environment where things like voting and people's choice of their elected representatives and all of these things are emphasized, the idea is that at the end of the process, at the end of the education process, you will be turning out citizens who know how to behave and what's expected of them as citizens in a republic. The idea that this is a science, that you can do research on political structures. If you want the best example of this, when Jefferson was coming back, prior to the Constitutional Convention, Jefferson was in France, and Madison is in constant communication. I remember we had the number of letters between the two. It's in excess of 30 during this 2-year period, and they are extensive letters. But Madison talks about the upcoming Constitutional Convention and tells Jefferson, anything you can do to help me in terms of books. I'm looking for books on the ancients. I want to look at histories of republics in the past. I want to see how they were structured, how they worked, why they failed, what parts of them succeeded. Because he was fashioning what becomes the Virginia Plan. And Jefferson responds that he is sending several, I think it's 3, trunks full of books from France to Madison. Talk about research. So when Madison, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, presents the Virginia Plan, which is his solution to the problems of the Articles of Confederation, this is not just something that came out of Madison's head as part of a dream. Madison has been reading and researching and questioning and analyzing the pros and cons of forms of government forever. He's been looking at Machiavelli. He's been looking at those who look at citizens as cynical. He's been looking at ancient Athens and at the Roman Republic. What kinds of things were expected of citizens? What kind of virtue was citizens expected to bring to the table that would make republicanism possible? And this is the kind of research. Well, as we know, one of the things that comes out of the Civil War during the Lincoln administration is Congress's passage of the so-called Morrill Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act of, I think it's 1864. And part of the requirement for the Moral Land Grant Act is the requirement that states set up state universities. This is the origin of land grant colleges. It's not exclusive to this anymore, but this is where the idea of the Big Ten came from. The University of Iowa, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Minnesota, Ohio State University, Indiana University. And the whole idea is that these are statewide research institutions. And the idea is they have a public commitment, a public service. Their goal is to service the public. And the way they do that is they sponsor and they fund research for the betterment of the society as a whole. So they go into the study of political systems and government, and they are actually able to assume that the study of government is a science. Think about this. Think about the idea of Darwin and his research in natural science. The idea in the laboratory, you do certain things in chemistry or in biology, and you basically assess the results using a microscope or a gyroscope or many of these other things. And that ultimately the reason that the natural sciences are so unique and in some cases so difficult for people is the assumption is that if you do the same experiment in the same way over and over again, you'll get the same result. In other words, this is truth. People have faith in this. They call it science because they believe it's valid. And the mere fact that you can recreate it in the laboratory and produce the same results makes it credible, makes it a science, makes it valid. Can you imagine attaching the word science and pairing it up with political? Researchers in major universities in America in the late 19th and early 20th century actually believed that if you set up certain political structures in certain political ways, you could produce predictable results. They believed that it was truth. It was valid. In economics, looking at Adam Smith and the theories of the free market and the ideas of competition and all of those things. And the assumption is that unregulated free enterprise, and this becomes kind of the essence around which the whole discipline of the study of economics emerges. And the assumption is the role of these researchers in these universities is to contribute the benefits and the products of their research to the kinds of challenges that the nation is facing during this period. And progressivism has total faith in the product of these researchers. In order to clean up the cities, if you have transportation problems, if you have problems of flooding and mud in the cities, if you have housing problems, if you have disease and slums and crimes and health and vermin and rats and all of these other things that go with a city that is growing faster than the fathers of the city can respond to it. If you have all of these problems, if you have problems between groups of people, ethnic groups, Italians and Irish, or Italians and Czechs, or Poles, or Russians, or whatever, who live in their own neighborhoods, and you have wars and gang wars between these groups, how do you solve them? You go to the universities and you find the PhDs, the experts, who have conducted and are familiar with the research in these areas, and you ask these people for recommended solutions, and government responds to those solutions with legislation. Government becomes dependent on academic research. That's what the whole intent of the Moral Land Grant and the establishment of land grant colleges was all about. Higher education had a public interest commitment to help the nation address and solve the problems of a growing industrial nation. And this is the period when the research from sociologists and psychologists and economists and historians and all the rest of it are coming to play, and people are using it and applying this research to meet the day-to-day problems. And obviously, the issue here, the entity here that is most receptive to this kind of research is government. Because, for example, if you have gang wars, you go to sociologists and you say, what can we do in order to alleviate the hostility and the violence that exists between these two adjoining neighborhoods? And one of the solutions is you begin at the very beginning in schools, and you get them to go to school together. You get them to study together, play athletics together, play football and baseball and basketball and all the rest of it. You encourage them to understand the priorities and the culture, the other cultures, and appreciate other cultures, and appreciate the differences as well as the similarities of other cultures. And you ultimately create what is called a melting pot, where people get used to the idea that everybody isn't the same, but in the things that really matter, they are. All of this becomes part of what progressivism is all about. It's one of the most fascinating topics because its purpose is designed to address real problems in the real world that the nation faces. And as Roosevelt sketched out in his new nationalism speech, if we don't find a way to address these problems, we're going to really be in trouble. This nation is not going to make it. And so Roosevelt sees the major source of the problems coming in the conflict and contest between labor and management, between the property, the wealthy, and the not wealthy. And what we have here is a real threat to the value system that really drives American society, the value systems of individual liberty and equality of opportunity. If there's no opportunity, what good is liberty, people would say? Free to do what? Because the whole idea of liberty is that it's controlled liberty. It's the freedom to do what's right, not the freedom to do what's wrong. And that's part of the message that the social sciences teach. So if you remember, and I'm looking back at what we covered yesterday about in Roosevelt, he talked about these, if you remember, the creation of the Federal Bureau of Corporations, whose job was to manage corporations in the public interest. And he said we should be as sure of the proper conduct of the interstate railways and the proper management of interstate business as we are now sure of the conduct and management of our national banks. And we should have as effective supervision in one case as in the other. And for railroads, out of this in 1906 comes the Hepburn Act, which creates and gives the Interstate Commerce Commission power to regulate the behavior of railroad corporations in interstate commerce. And if you remember, we've moved from state levels because the courts have said once a railroad crosses from one state into another, then no one state can control it. So now we have the federal government moving in and making the controls or establishing the rules from the top. And then, if you remember, Roosevelt talked about the problem of wealth and the distribution of wealth in society. And he talked about a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men and what that situation was doing to the nation as a whole. And if you remember, he said, we quoted this yesterday toward the end of the program, we grudge no man a fortune which represents his own power. We grudge no man a fortune in civil life if it is honorably obtained and well used. It is not even enough that it should have been gained without doing damage to the community. we should permit it to be gained only so long as the gaining represents a benefit to the community. Government's responsibility is to look at success and recognize that in order for success to be condoned, it must be something that benefits the society as a whole. The fact that somebody like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett is able to control the millions and tens of millions and in perhaps even billions of dollars that some of these people do, it must be something, Roosevelt is saying, that benefits the public interest. It's not enough that they didn't commit any crimes getting it. The fact of the matter is, in order to justify them having it, there's got to be some social benefit or community benefit to it. If there doesn't, if there is no social positive benefit to it, then the mere existence of that much wealth in the hands of so few people becomes a threat to society because it minimizes the amount of opportunity available to others. It decreases the value of equality of opportunity in America. It sends the message to individual people and to youngsters that there's nothing worth competing for. There's nothing left out there. In the last 2 days, we have witnessed in America the purchase of the Boston Globe by John Henry, who owns the Boston Red Sox, for $70 million. And then the very next day, which was yesterday, the purchase of the Washington Post by the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos. Most of the attention has focused principally on whether the owner of the Red Sox owning the Boston Globe is going to mean that the Globe's coverage of the Red Sox is going to kind of be effectively snowball, softball journalism. Most people's concern is with the Red Sox, and whether in fact the Red Sox are going to face the same kind of journalistic integrity and journalistic prying that freedom of the press is all about when the same man that owns the team owns the newspaper. I would suggest to you, however, that there's something even more important going on here. Because what we're seeing is the transition of major newspapers into the hands of people and organizations that have clear corporate interests that may conform to the public interest in a lot of ways, but likely in many ways do not. I would suggest that the potential impact of these sales to the whole idea of free press in America is really significant. There's no way at this point to predict or to see it. But the fact of the matter is we know that America's major networks are owned by corporate interests that have raised serious questions about how reliable the news is when the people delivering us the news have their own corporate agenda. Does that have an effect on what they report on and what they don't report on, what they cover and what they don't recover? To what extent are these major newspaper outlets going to become mouthpieces for the individuals or the organizations that own them. That, I would suggest to you, is the big issue. Also, if you check, you'll find that other major newspapers in the country, like the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune, I believe, are also on the market. There is a gargantuan shift happening in corporate America in relationship to the way people get their news. And if you don't believe that this is significant, then I ask you to think about the situation of Edward Snowden and his release of information, and whether he should be a protected whistleblower who's giving the public information that the public would not get in any other way. If the people are going to hold their government accountable, then they need information. Are they going to get the kind of information they need for accountability purposes if they have to depend on government to give it to them? In effect, is Edward Snowden a hero? Or, on the other hand, is he a threat to the security of the United States? Is he providing aid and comfort to the enemy, whoever the enemy might be? It seems to me all of these questions are really significant. And part of an organization like the Virtual Center is to basically raise some of these issues. These are genuine, significant, substantive, constitutional issues that need to be out there and need to be raised and need to be addressed. I don't have the answers. But I think it's absolutely vital that we begin to sensitize our people to some of the things that are going on and the relationship that they have, that these things have, to the basic principles on which this republic is founded. And that's really what the Virtual Center is about. And that's why it's important to keep a network like the Head On Radio Network on the air. It's absolutely critical to keep this voice out there, because more and more we're moving in a direction where the people we trust to give us the information have an agenda which may not work in our favor. It may suggest that those we depend on to give us information will be better served if they don't give us that information, or if they give us that information in a way which involves a whole lot of spin. I'm struck, obviously, by the Fox News O'Reilly program about the no-spin zone. And I would suggest to you that not spinning a particular issue in one direction is not the same as not having any spin at all. I would suggest to you that thinking about an issue which suggests that if it doesn't agree with what I believe, it's spin, therefore the implication being that I reflect no spin, when in fact what I might reflect is an alternative spin. And it's up to the listener, to the citizen, to be able to cut through and recognize spin for what it is in whatever direction it's coming from. That's why people need information. There's no question that we're going to get information from the people who have a vested interest in getting out their story. Our major networks and newspapers, in many cases, it seems to me, are in danger of becoming mouthpieces for the very interest that we need to control and regulate and manage. There needs to be an outlet. There needs to be a place where people get information that these entities and these groups don't want released. Otherwise, the whole idea of citizens holding the government accountable, the whole idea of freedom of the press, and all the things we take for granted in this society as inalienable rights become meaningless. So, in a sense, I believe that understanding the progressive period and where progressives are coming from and what they want and what the alternatives are that they are facing is very, very important. I personally believe, as I said yesterday, I believe that Gabriel Kolko's triumph of conservatism has validity. I don't think it's the whole story. But I think it's very important to recognize that progressivism is not the alternative to conservatism. Progressivism is a midpoint between conservatism on the one hand and radicalism on the other. And we need to basically understand that and to be able to get our minds around, or our arms around, that kind of framework. It is 1 minute after the hour. We have completed our first hour at the Virtual Center today. Let's pause and take a 4 or 5 minute break. We'll come back. We'll pick up a little bit with Roosevelt. Then I want to get into the case that I mentioned earlier, which is Lochner versus New York. We'll be right back after a 4 or 5 minute break. Please stay with us.
We will rejoin Dr. Bill O'Brien and the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution momentarily. Dr. Bill? We'll be right back. And here's Dr. Bill. Dr. Bill? Dr. Bill? We now rejoin Dr. Bill O'Brien. Here's Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to this second hour of our virtual center. It's 20 minutes after the hour. We ran into a few technical difficulties during the break, but I think we've got them corrected. And so we have about 35 or 40 minutes left in today's program, and I did want to pick up and at least try to reach the conclusion today with Theodore Roosevelt and progressivism, and we can pick up in our next program the Supreme Court cases I was referring to earlier. Again, let me remind you, our phone number, area code 304-658-3333. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. And a reminder that next week, on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we will not have phone access because the programs will be repeat programs from before. I'll be on the road the first part of the week. I won't return until the end, so we'll get together live a week from next Monday, and we'll pick up on this. So let me encourage you, if during the programs next week, if you pick up questions or have concerns or observations or whatever that you think not only I would be interested in, but all of our listeners would be in, then please hold them, jot them down, and make it a point to call 304-658-3333 when we're back in session week after next. I wanted to pick up on Roosevelt, on Roosevelt's approach to the New Deal. I wanted to begin with a sentence which I think is one of the most important sentences in this entire speech. and it was one that we touched on yesterday, and I just wanted to reiterate it before we went on. Roosevelt says the people of the United States suffer from periodic financial panics to a degree substantially unknown to other nations, which approach us in financial strength. There is no reason why we should suffer what they escape. It is of profound importance that our financial system should be promptly investigated and so thoroughly and effectively revised as to make it certain that hereafter our currency will no longer fail at critical times to meet our needs. Roosevelt's point here, of course, is that many of the people who are responsible for creating the financial problems that the nation faces, and this is Roosevelt talking in early 20th century, are not the people who suffer from the results. Rather, the population as a whole tends to suffer. And he said, other nations don't seem to have these kinds of financial panics that we do. And although he doesn't say it, part of the reason is because their governments have the power to regulate and manage and interfere and oversee. And that's what Roosevelt is advocating here in his new nationalism or square deal or view of progressivism or whatever you want to call it. Roosevelt goes into the power of the nation in terms of international affairs. And this is not a surprise for people that are familiar with Roosevelt. He is in favor of an efficient army and navy, one that is going to get respect abroad. And his argument is that our power is the surest guarantee of peace in the world. What we say today in terms of America's military control and power is not new. Roosevelt was saying it 100 years ago. That the peace of the world is contingent directly on the power of the United States because we are so influential, or at the time that Roosevelt is writing, we are potentially that influential. And then Roosevelt makes a point which I don't need to elaborate on, but I think it's very significant. He said, if you get into trouble here, you can call for the police. But if Uncle Sam's gets into trouble, he's got to be his own policeman. And I want to see him strong enough to encourage the peaceful aspirations of other peoples in connection with us. I believe, he said, in national friendships and heartiest goodwill to all nations. But national friendships, like those between men, must be founded on respect as well as on liking, on forbearance as well as upon trust. I should be heartily ashamed of any American who did not try to make the American government act as justly toward the other nations in international relations as he himself would act toward any individual in private relations. Basically, the idea that America's success economically, socially, and politically is going to be directly connected to our military power. That the kind of peaceful world that we must have in order to work our free enterprise magic is going to require the backup military and Navy power necessary to make sure that we operate in the kind of an international environment which this requires. And then Roosevelt goes into two issues that I want to deal with before we drop Roosevelt today. And I think we have enough time. We're just approaching the bottom of the hour. We have the better part of a full half hour to go. And the two issues that Roosevelt addresses that I think really warrant our attention because they are so relevant today are labor relations and conservation. One of the results that Roosevelt is best known for in the history books is his support for and defense of conservation. Most people believe that the national parks that the nation enjoys today owe their very existence to Theodore Roosevelt. He was a strong conservationist. And the issues that he raises about conservation are issues that are very telling today, with the issues of mountaintop removal and the issues of fracking in the pursuit of natural gas, and all of these other things suggest that conservation is not an issue that is off the table. And so I think going back and looking at Roosevelt, who has, has a reputation in history as being one of our strongest conservationists, I think is very, very relevant. And he said, of conservation I shall speak more at length elsewhere, and he does later. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that come after us. Roosevelt is basically suggesting that development is only half the equation. He goes on, moreover, I believe that the natural resources must be used for the benefit of all our people and not monopolized for the benefit of the few. And here again is another case in which I am accused of taking a revolutionary attitude, he says. People forget now that 100 years ago, there were public men of good character who advocated the nation selling off its public lands to get quantities, in great quantities, so that the nation could get the most money out of it, and giving it to the men who would cultivate it for their own uses. We took the proper democratic ground that the land should be granted in small sections to the men who were actually to till it and live on it. People who will go with us in conserving the resources only if they are to be allowed to exploit them for their own benefit. That's one of the fundamental reasons why the special interests should be driven out of politics. Conservation, Roosevelt said, is a great moral issue. We have, and by we I mean government, society as a whole, we have a responsibility to the generations which follow us. And it raises serious questions about our ability, our right, to blow up the mountains and pollute the rivers and pollute the air and overfish the oceans and all the other things that are associated with my private right to pursue my own self-interest as being what living in America is all about. We have, as a society, overemphasized the rights and downplayed the responsibilities of citizenship, including corporate citizenship and corporate responsibility. And that is the issue that Roosevelt raises probably more strongly than anybody else. So Roosevelt talks about the creation of the Departments of Agriculture in various states, about the creation of the United States Department of Agriculture, and about the establishment of agricultural colleges and experiment stations that should extend their work to cover all phases of farm life in America. Roosevelt really believes that we have to live up to the responsibility of the public interest in the ways we approach conservation. This today is one of the most vital interests and issues, it seems to me, that all of us face. There is a story coming out of Martin County, Kentucky, right now, about the county's decision to shut down a high school because of the development and mountaintop removal that's going on around it. In effect, the education of the young is being sacrificed to the private entrepreneurial interests of the few. We have got to basically have a government with the power to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen. That's what Roosevelt was saying 100 years ago. Obviously, somebody needs to begin espousing that same message again today. And then Roosevelt, in one of the key paragraphs, I've circled this one because of the philosophy inherent in it, Roosevelt says, nothing is more true than that excess of every kind is followed by reaction, a fact which should be pondered by reformer and reactionary alike. When excess is allowed to happen, it produces reaction on the other end. What we need is control of excess. And of course, Roosevelt would say that only government can provide that kind of stability and that kind of control. Roosevelt says, we are face to face with new conceptions of the relations of property to human welfare, chiefly because certain advocates of the rights of property, as against the rights of men, have been pushing their claims too far. The man who wrongly holds that every human right is secondary to his own profit must now give way to the advocate of human welfare, who rightly maintains that every man holds his property subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it. What a sentence. Think about this as you think about its application to some of the issues that we still confront in America and the world today. We are face to face, Roosevelt says, with new conceptions of the relations of property to human welfare, chiefly because certain advocates of the rights of property, as against the rights of men, have been pushing their claims too far. The man who wrongly holds that every human right is secondary to his own profit must now give way to the advocate of human welfare, who rightly maintains that every man holds his property subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it. What we have because of the community and the environment and the nation we live in. Therefore, everything we have has a public component. And our right to it is not absolute. Our right to it is contingent on the best interest of the community at large. And if we don't do it, Roosevelt would say, then we will end up reaping what we have sown. And that's the violence that the nation was experiencing during this period. The reaction to the excess that Roosevelt speaks about. And then he goes into the issue of labor. And given the attention that we've devoted in recent programs to the idea of co-determination and to the labor situation that we currently face in America and have faced for a long time, I think it's very, very significant that we consider and reflect upon what Theodore Roosevelt is saying from the progressive perspective about labor, about the rights of labor and the rights of management and all the rest of it. So if you bear with me, I want to share with you this very, very important issue that Roosevelt raises. He has just talked about property, everybody's property being subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it. Then he goes on and says, but I think we may go still further. The right to regulate the use of wealth in the public interest is universally admitted. Let me repeat that sentence. The right to regulate the use of wealth in the public interest is universally admitted. Let us admit also the right to regulate the terms and conditions of labor, which is the chief element of wealth, directly in the interest of the common good. The fundamental thing to do for every man is to give him a chance to reach a place in which he will make the greatest possible contribution to the public welfare. Think about this. Not that he would have an opportunity to enrich himself, but government's responsibility to its citizens is to maximize their ability to contribute to the common good. Because the common good is government's principal responsibility, not private rights, according to Roosevelt. The fundamental thing, I'm repeating, the fundamental thing to do for every man is to give him a chance to reach a place in which he will make the greatest possible contribution to the public welfare. And Roosevelt continues, understand what I say here, he says. Give him a chance, not push him up if he will not be pushed. Help any man who stumbles. If he lies down, it is a poor job to try to carry him. But if he's a worthy man, try your best to see that he gets a chance to show the worth that is in him. Wow. You don't carry people generation after generation, but you must do what is necessary to get them back on their feet. And part of it is determining whether, in fact, they have the will to get back on their feet. If they do, then they have a right as citizens to our support in that effort. Help any man who stumbles. If he lies down, it's a poor job to try to carry him. But if he's a worthy man, try your best to see that he gets a chance to show the worth that is in him. No man can be a good citizen unless he has a wage more than sufficient to cover the bare cost of living, and hours of labor short enough so after his day's work is done, he will have time and energy to bear his share in the management of the community, to help in carrying the general load. People's responsibilities are never only to themselves. Never. Part of living in this society is to recognize that all of us have a public responsibility. The wealthy have a public responsibility. They must know that their wealth must be held in the public interest. If it's contrary to the public interest, then the community has a right to do something about that, Roosevelt is saying. Every man has a right to a wage more than sufficient to cover the bare cost of living and hours of labor short enough so that after his day's work is done, he will have time and energy to bear his share in the management of the community, to help in carrying the general load. We keep countless men from being good citizens by the conditions of life by which we surround them. We need comprehensive workmen's compensation acts, both state and national laws, to regulate child labor and work for women. And especially, we need in our common schools not merely education in book learning, but also practical training for daily life and work. We need to enforce better sanitary conditions for our workers and to extend the use of safety appliances for workers in industry and commerce, both within and between the states. Also, friends, in the interest of the working man himself, we need to set our faces like flint against mob violence just as against corporate greed, against violence and injustice and lawlessness by wage workers, just as much as against lawless cunning and greed and selfish arrogance of employers. This is a classic statement of what progressivism is about. We do not give in to either extreme, because excess in any form produces reaction. We need to set our faces like flint against mob violence, just as against corporate greed, against violence and injustice and lawlessness by wage earners, wage workers, just as much as against lawless cunning and greed and selfish arrogance of employers. If I could ask but one thing of my fellow countrymen, he said, my request would be that whenever they go in for reform, they remember the two sides, and that they always exact justice from one side as much as from the other. I have small use for the public servant who can always see and denounce the corruption of the capitalist, but who cannot persuade himself, especially before election, to say a word about lawless mob violence. And I have equally small use for the man, be he a judge on the bench or editor of a great newspaper, or wealthy and influential private citizen, who can see clearly enough and denounce the lawlessness of mob violence, but whose eyes are closed so that he is also blind when the question is one of corruption of business on a gigantic scale. Also remember what I said about excess in reformer and reactionary alike. If the reactionary man who thinks of nothing but the rights of property could have his way, he would bring about a revolution. And one of my chief fears in connection with progress comes because I do not want to see our people, for lack of proper leadership, compelled to follow men whose intentions are excellent, but whose eyes are a little too wild to make it really safe to trust them. What a statement. Where has it been in the last 4 or 5 years? People who only see one side or the other. Let me go back to something else we talked about earlier today. Think about the media. Think about the people who flip the buttons, who push the buttons to get the appropriate channels. One person to get Fox, the other person to tune in MSNBC. What we've got to have, Roosevelt said, is a balance. The nation's welfare will be put in jeopardy if either one of those positions is able to take power. Let me put this situation in today's terms. If the Tea Party is able to inflict a takeover of all the branches of government by the Republican Party, and if the Tea Party continues to be in the position that it's in now of dictating the priorities and the agenda of the Republican Party, this nation will face revolution. It is that simple. On the other hand, if we take the exact opposite position and put those in positions of power whose number one priority is to obliterate the conservative opposition, we will be confronted with consequences equally as dire. The economy that we that we're familiar with will be no more. Roosevelt says, here in Kansas, there is one newspaper which habitually denounces me as the tool of Wall Street, and at the same time frantically repudiates the statement that I am a socialist on the grounds that that is an unwarranted slander of the socialists. In other words, what he's saying is one of the media outlets in Kansas where he's giving his speech feels that he even goes further than the socialists go, that he gives socialism a bad name, Roosevelt is saying. So again, we have 10 minutes left in today's program. Roosevelt's position is that we have got to manage the factions that seek to take power over our society at the expense of those on the other side. By inference, Roosevelt is suggesting is that only government has the wherewithal, as well as the charge under the Constitution of the United States, as articulated in the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to establish a more perfect union, promote justice, provide for the common welfare, secure domestic tranquility, etc., etc., etc. I'm paraphrasing here. Government's responsibility is to manage and represent the public interest. That means not only responding to the public interest as defined by the people. That means defining the public interest in the interest of the people. Remember, Madison made this very important distinction 230 years ago. The small republic that Montesquieu argued for, the small republic that the Articles of Confederation sought to put into place by establishing state supremacy over the national government. The basic premise was that was the only way that you could reform, that you could provide or guarantee Republican government, because the republic had to be small enough for the voice and the will of the people to direct and dictate to government what needed to be done. Madison's position was that is one of the main flaws in the Confederation. It takes priority status in his Vices of the American Political System, which he writes in April of 1787. Madison's position is that government must have the power to define the public interest. But part of Madison's charge is to make sure that the right people are in the right places in government, that the right people are calling the shots. The few. But what has happened in American society is that excess, not access, but excess, has taken hold. And the product, the results of the Industrial Revolution in America have become so skewed in favor of corporate America that the reaction threatens to destroy the nation. And progressivism is the response to that situation. It is a response to it is a strategy to manage conflict. It is a strategy which depends almost exclusively on people's willingness to trust government to be fair and just, to recognize that government's priority responsibility is to define and reflect and represent the public interest, not become the product or the puppet of special interests. Today, we face in our society a situation where special interests have been able to establish such control over the definition of the public interest that the use of the term public interest in the eyes of many people has no meaning. It's become a sham. That, in effect, government's primary responsibility or primary activity in the eyes of some people is to enact and justify and legitimize the greed and the self-interest of the few at the expense of the many. And that is being reflected in our tax laws, in our laws of eminent domain, in our commitment to the sanctity of private property, in our willingness to support the interests of the few when it conflicts with the public interest, are willing to sacrifice the education of the next generation to the private interests of the few. All of these things that we are experiencing today in our news suggests that we are in need for something like a rebirth of the perspective that Roosevelt brings to us here in what constitutes progressivism. It is very obvious that corporate America is going to paint Roosevelt as a radical and a revolutionary. Their strategy is going to be to suggest that they are the moderate middle and that anything to the left of them is radical. That is exactly what conservative America has been successful and able to do today through its access to the media. Of course, they say that liberals, that progressives control the media. But the fact of the matter is, with the birth and the tremendous power of talk radio, of terrestrial radio, and all the rest of it, corporate control of newspapers, ownership of newspapers, and all the rest of it, the fact of the matter is that people's balance and perspective has become skewed. The strategy is to paint their conservative position as the moderate position. To recognize that there are a few who are more extremely right than they are, yes. But to paint all progressives and critics of what they stand for as radicals. Our inclination and tendency today to associate progressivism with radicals is the result of the fact that progressives have allowed conservatives to define progressivism. Progressives have not defended their own position. And part of the reason is because they don't understand it. I have to say this. What we are covering here on the Head On Radio Network and at this virtual center is information and perspective that the vast percentage of the leaders who are making the decisions in this country are not privy to. Our education system doesn't cover this. It doesn't address it. Rather, the media and everybody who depends on the media falls into line and buys the idea that if you don't agree with me, if you are to the left of me, you are a radical. The implication that I am not a radical, I am the middle. That's what talk radio and Fox News and the rest of the conservative media have been able to do, is establish that position. They have been able to take control of the middle. They have been able to claim that their position is the middle position. I would suggest to you, their position is part of the excess that Roosevelt warned about. And it is in danger, it is already happening, of producing the reaction that Roosevelt predicted 100 years ago. We have got to take back America. We have got to. I don't really think that there's much more to say on today's version of the Virtual Center. So I will say thank you and turn it over to Bob Kincaid and the Head On Radio Network. Thank you.